All right, Pete. First of all, thanks for joining this conversation. Thanks for making the time in your lovely morning to join me and my audience to talk about your story and how exactly in your marketing experience, how do you usually use storytelling to push the brands that you have worked with. A couple of things stood out to me when we got connected and we started chatting about this conversation, but one of them was the portfolio of clients and corporations that you have worked with. And down the road in this conversation, I'm going to ask how actually you connect, like what are the main things, what are the common things between brands like Lego and Google, or Mastercard and Microsoft and Epic Games. Like, how do you connect those dots? But
hmm
before anything, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Nice. As we always tell our audience, we follow the hero journey initially to see the wins, the losses of the people that I interview. In one way or another, once we start striving for something, once we start applying our ambitions, we are one kind of a hero. As soon as you struggle with something, as soon as you face some obstacles, in one way or another, you become a hero. I would love to know what was the initial setting for you. What pushed you towards this journey that you have currently? Now, I know that in your description you mentioned that some of the first steps were from your dorm room, establishing an agency from your dorm room. So picture the situation and picture what was going through your head at this point.
Yeah. Well, the first one I'll say is a huge fan of the hero's journey. Love Joseph Campbell and um, Carl Jung and just all the smart people that have come up with these frameworks and thought about that. One is I think of the customer as the hero, and I think of myself as the guide. But just to sort of stick to your format of the hero's journey, what I would say is, um, I think so I'm a designer developer by trade, and I started writing code as a kid, started designing as a kid, just a really big nerd when it comes to those things. And ultimately, one of my first jobs at a corporation was doing a combination of design work and then also development work. And I did both, which is more common now, but it was less common back then. And ultimately, what happened is I got to a point where my boss said, I have to choose between either being a designer or a developer. And that sort of was like a very internal conflict for me because, as someone with ADHD, as someone who has a lot of passions and interests, I don't believe in or, I really do believe in and. And it's something that's really defined me in terms of who I am as a person, who I am as a professional, who I am as a leader. And that was ultimately what drove me to leave a job because I did not want to choose between this or that. I wanted to do and I believed that there was an opportunity to combine, what the customer needed, the end user with design and technology to create experiences that were really rewarding for them, but also could be rewarding for the brand. Because everything's about reciprocity, right? If it's a one-way relationship, it's just a transaction, and a two-way relationships are ultimately what creates value on both sides of the table. So I had that idea back then. It wasn't as well thought out now, as it was, it wasn't as well thought out back then as it is now, but that's ultimately what began the journey of me starting a digital agency in my dorm room at University of Connecticut.
Love the brief introduction that you are doing, and it's very funny that there are two distinct things that have contradicted, and you actually decided to use both of your powers and find this niche that you can serve. What would be some of the similarities, or how exactly do you combine, the more creative stuff, the design stuff, with the more technical and structured part, which is the coding part?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think the problem that is most people think that, you know, one thing's a left brain exercise, one thing's a right brain exercise. And I would actually argue that that's wrong.
Okay.
The best coders and engineers that I know that, some of my friends work at Google and Amazon and some of these big tech companies. And the most brilliant engineers that I know are massively creative people. I like to think of code as poetry And whether or not AIs come in and change that or not, we can talk about that later in a bit. But at the end of the day, code is poetry. And I think that when I think about how do I structure coding problems, it's always a creative approach. It's not just a linear approach. It might seem linear in terms of these inputs drive these outputs drive these outcomes. Absolutely. But I do think that structuring information and structuring problem solving is something that can be highly creative. So for me, I always was really curious as a kid. I was always really creative as a kid, playing with things, taking things apart when I was 5 and 6 years old. And I think it was that sort of curiosity that led me to technology, that led me to computers. And I think it was ultimately that creativity that helped me to figure out how to solve problems differently. I wouldn't consider myself sort of a classic computer scientist. I would consider myself much more of a creative technologist, someone who's using technology and using design in a way to solve problems. And that's what I've done my whole career. And so I sort of fight back, I push back on this idea that one activity is left brain, one activity is right brain. I actually think when you can tap into both hemispheres of your brain, you can actually unlock significantly more positive outcomes and growth.
A couple of things here. Thanks for this accurate answer. But the main thing that stood out to me is obviously this is kind of a superpower, close to a superpower, to be able to juggle between the one of the hemispheres with the other one and combine those powers. But I love the fact that you mentioned a couple of times how important structure is, because you already mentioned in the beginning, the first question, that being an expert who actually needs to work through ADHD and all of those things around you might grab your attention and might distract you. The best tool that you can have is structure. This is why I'm also using the hero's journey, because when I started as a copywriter, when I got introduced to a couple of frameworks, we know the PSA framework or the IDA framework, and eventually the hero's journey is so well put out that even if you don't have the initial knowledge, you can just follow the steps and come up with something that is attention grabbing, right? So
Absolutely. I always say constraints drive creativity. And I think, it's like, give me the freedom of a tight brief, is what I say to my teams a lot, which is that, the more you can create a frame, a structure, clarity around the problem you're solving, the constraints ultimately drive that creativity. People often talk about thinking outside the box. What I always say is the most important thing is to define the box, right? Because it's not about thinking inside or outside the box. It's actually understanding, defining what is the box. And I think that a lot of people jump to solutions before actually asking themselves, what is the problem I'm solving? And am I solving the right problem? So I absolutely agree with you. And I love that you're structuring something inside the framework of the hero's journey, which is a, tried and true way to approach storytelling, from the likes of Pixar to Disney to people that were in caves in the Roman Empire and all this other stuff. Like, hero's journey can be applied to everything. And, especially when you use it in advertising and social media, it all works. So I love that you're thinking that way and tapping into that true and tested knowledge.
great that we're on the same page on this. And the follow-up question before I dive deeper into the failures that you stumbled upon as a young expert is, well, how exactly does the you mentioned a lot on your pages about the human-centric approach, and now you mentioned about thinking outside the box and defining exactly what is this box, what is this solution that we are after. And in my experience, I've stumbled that a lot of companies know that they offer something, but this is the only thing they know, that they are offering something. So how exactly do you define the box, and is it somehow human centric, this definition? Do you think about the end customer before you start defining it?
Yeah. So let me first do one thing and just sort of define what I mean by human
Okay.
centered, because it's such a fucking buzzword, right? It's such a buzzword. HCD, HCI, blah, blah, blah. UXD. There's just so many buzzwords in our industry.
Yeah.
And that we sort of, we get high on our own supply. I think in a lot of ways, um, brands, engineers, people tend to mentally masturbate on smart jargon. And what they ultimately end up doing is focusing on the technology, focusing on the features, focusing on the benefits, but they're not focusing on the person. So when I say human centered, all I basically mean is, what is the problem that my customer has? And ultimately, what's the transformation? So I think about like, what's my customer's world before the product? What's my customer's world after the product? So most people sell features and benefits. Most people sell vitamins, which it's nice to have vitamins. I like to sell painkillers. I like to solve the thing that's going to ultimately create the transformation. And a lot of times people spend so much energy doing the fanciest tech or the fanciest design when the reality is they're not actually understanding the real problem because they're just not talking to the customer. They're not talking to the consumer. They're not understanding how people use their product, whether it's a physical product or a digital product or a software product, which is a lot of the products that I work on. So I think a lot of times it's getting into the head and the heart of the customer. And what I mean by that specifically is conversation, listening, seeing not what they say, but more importantly, what they do, right? Some people call it the unarticulated needs, meaning the things that they really need that they don't tell you. So what I like to do in that situation is when I'm focusing on, you can use fancy words like ethnography, but really it's observation, right? It's observation-based design. See the problems, see the possibilities, and design the transformation, whether it's at the product level, at the marketing level, at the experience level. And it sounds easy. It's not, right? The hardest part is getting that true insight that really can break through the noise and then creating an experience, whether that experience is you using code or you using design or whatever it is, graphics, to be able to make that happen. That's what I mean by solving problems with human-centered design and focusing on the end customer. Because when you can control the mind of the customer, you can control the wallet of the customer, and then everybody's happy. Is now the customer sees the value, they buy in, whether it's a subscription, whether it's a purchase, whether it's a repurchase. And then the business and the brand can keep creating things. They can keep innovating because they have a customer that keeps coming back that has high lifetime value. So now you have a reciprocal exchange of value. Me, the brand, who typically hires me and my team, the brand is able to create a product or service and keep delivering it. The customer is able to be a customer of that. They see the value, so they keep coming back for more, like Netflix subscription or a streaming subscription or buying the new iPhone every time it comes out or getting that new app that you pay a couple dollars a month for. So I think a lot of times, to answer your question, I think brands and technology people are very similar in that sometimes they get so caught up in their own story, they forget about the most important story, which is the customer story. And that's ultimately what I like to push for. And when I can connect those dots together, I'm basically an overpaid matchmaker.
I love this definition of the overpaid matchmaker, but just want to confirm it's kind of what you're saying, that we as experts tend to overcomplicate stuff, and as you mentioned, fall in love in our own jargon, and while we should be just listening more closely to the customer's expectations, the customer's feedback, and what exactly, what is the transformation that they are looking for. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. I want to push it one step further,
Okay.
if that's okay, which is I think it's less about what the customers say and more about what the customers do, right? So the famous thing that everyone always hears is if Henry Ford asked his customers what they wanted, they'd want a faster horse
Yes.
and we wouldn't have the car, right? Who knows if he actually said that or not, because there's a lot of places that say he did. But regardless, the main point I have is I like to watch what people do, right? So a perfect example is the other day I was in the subway in New York City and I was watching someone play a game. And instead of paying for the game, every time they would run out of turns, they would quit out of the app. They'd go to a different game. They'd play through the turns. They'd quit out of the app and they'd go through a different game. Now, what I realized is all the three games that they kept switching between were actually all owned by the same gaming company. Now, I work with some gaming companies, so I noticed that. And I said, wouldn't it be great if that gaming company was able to capture the value of that customer across all three of those properties, right? More than just selling an ad, more than just selling something. How can they create value that connects those dots together, right? That to me is an observation. But I'd be willing to bet if we surveyed that customer and we put a microphone in front of them and said, what's something that you really want? They might say, well, I want the game for free, or I want more turns on the game, right? But if we said, hey, if you pay for this game, every time you get to the third level in this game, we're going to give you points that you can redeem at your favorite website or at your favorite store. Now, imagine that gaming company can capture all that revenue, right? And what do they do with that revenue? They take that revenue now and they could park it in a high yield savings account or something, right? The going rate in America right now is around 5%, right? So now they could park that in a 5% yield savings account, and they could give back the value to the customer by paying the people in the marketplaces that they do. I just came up with that idea while I was sitting on the subway, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. But now, as a result of it, I had that idea. I shared that with one of my team members. Somebody sent an email out to an old client, which is a gaming company, and now we're actually talking to them about how we can drive more value. That's observation-based design, right? The problem I think that people a lot of times have is they talk to a customer and the customer says, yeah, I'd be willing to pay this for that. And then you put a button in front of them that says pay for it now, and nobody ever signs up for it. So I think the reality is we have to be careful with the things that people do with their lips. We have to be much more focused on people do what they do with their fingers, right? Actually pay attention to the action, the behavior, not what they say. And that's the one thing I want to go deep on, because I see that mistake all the time in brands and customers, where people will listen, they spend all this money, mental masturbation, focus groups, and it's a lot of talk, but the actions then don't line up to the success that the customer wants or that the brand wants, and then everyone fails in the process.
This is a terrific insight. Well, to be honest, you have to have this quality of observing the things around you and the people around you and diving into a deeper detail to actually manifest all of those insights that you gather. But thanks for bringing this up. And yeah, it is, you need to take it a step further than just, the interview with the client. You need to take it a step further.
100%.
Speaking of transformations, and something else that I came across your core message was fail faster, innovate faster, which is it's catching up speed. People, even big corporations, try to experiment and to fail faster in order to look for new venues, for example. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is what every hero needs to go through in order to become the hero, to fail a couple of times, to push forward those obstacles. Walk me and our audience through the first failure that, grabbed your attention and created the person that you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first failure was like when I turned on a computer and I was trying to write code and I was typing things on the keyboard and it wasn't doing what I wanted. That was probably my first failure. I think the reality is that all experts begin as beginners. And I think the reality is it's less about failure, and I think it's more about learning, right? So when I think of the word fail, I think of it as an acronym: first attempt in learning.
Okay.
And what I mean by that specifically is, how do I work on getting 1% better every day? How do me and my teams really focus on progress and possibilities? Because it's the progress, it's the possibilities, it's the experimentation, it's the play. The play is ultimately what drives the progress. But what happens a lot of time, I see this with companies, the bigger that they get, the more that they're scared to fail. So when they're scared to fail, everything is risky. When everything's risky, the culture is not focused on innovation. It's not focused on creativity. It's not about failure, in my opinion. I think no one wants to fail. It sucks to fail. It sucks to fall down. When we're children and we're trying to get up and run, we trip and fall. We hurt ourselves sometimes, right? But what do you see a kid do? A kid just gets back up and they just keep doing it, right? I see that now as a new parent. My son's 2 now. But I also see that in organizations where leaders are afraid to fail. They're afraid to be wrong. They think they have to have all the answers. And I think that the experimentation aspect, whether it was the first time I failed at code, or whether it was the first time I shared an idea with a client that got smacked down and shut down, I think that resistance, I think that no is one of the most powerful words in the dictionary, because it's a complete sentence. No. And I think what ultimately happens there is you have to start with no to get to yes. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean like sales advice or whatever, but it's great sales advice. But what I mean by it is, like, you try to go lift a heavy object. No, it doesn't move, right? So what do? You have to start with a lighter object, less weight to start, right? So before you can write an entire application, back to my coding background, you have to be able to write a function.
Mm.
Before you can write a function, you have to learn syntax, right? You have to understand the underlying principles of how these things work, right? The same with design. Before you can do a beautiful design, you have to learn the tool. Once you learn the tool, you can understand how it works, and then you can skill stack. And I think skill stacking is something that people don't do enough, right? Too many people try to go from the level 1 grunt to the 5-star general in the military game. And I don't think that that's possible. It's just not. So I think that the reality is that every expert you see, whether it's an expert leader, an expert coder, an expert athlete, Olympian, it starts with beginner's mind. It starts with being present. It starts with setting an intention. And then perspiration is better than inspiration any day of the week. And that's the bottom line. So I hope that's helpful. My life has been a series of failures. My goal is, if I'm not teaching myself or making a mistake or failing every single day in some capacity, in my opinion, that means I'm stagnating and I'm not growing. And when we look at stagnation, stagnation is death, right? Stagnation in a pond is where algae grows, bacteria grows. Stagnation is death. We have to continue to grow, because it doesn't matter if it's AI or crypto or all the fancy shit that's hitting the internet right now. What matters is, are you adapting and pacing with the times, or are you falling behind? Because extinction is something that, you look at like natural selection, look at the universe, right? Like natural selection, it's the fittest who survive, right? It's those who keep growing that will stand the test of time. And that's, for me, like, as in my own hero's journey, like, I had a lot of failure. I had a lot of people telling me, no, that's not possible. No, you can't do that. No, you'll never do this. You'll never do that. So I think failure is an interesting thing that we need to dance with, but I think we have to change our relationship with failure. And that, I think, is where a growth mindset comes in a bigger way.
Great overview of your mindset, and two questions popped up in my head while we were speaking. First of all, I appreciate the metaphor you brought up with the kids, and I don't still don't have kids on my own, but something that I've noticed when a kid runs, he or she trips, they fall down on the ground, and they look for their mother or their father to see their reaction. If the if the reaction of the parent is like a little bit more stressful, they begin crying. So it's kind of as the grown-ups as well. If somebody else sees us failing, then we get into our head. Then it's probably, I assume, is the ego involved. Is, our insecurities involved, or what are people going to say now? So my question would be to you: how do you overcome these insecurities, or do you shut off the people's opinions? What is your mindset towards this?
That's a great question. Are you asking in terms of like how I look at it, or how I lead other people?
Well, I was leading for your own approach to it, because I was talking about your failures. So yeah, what was in the beginning? How did you approach those failures?
So in the beginning, I used to get really discouraged. I used to get really upset or mad when people would, I didn't have a lot of great role models that modeled what happens after failure, right? For me, you either won or you lost, right? There was no participation trophies in my era. And I think that's a gift and a curse, right? I think what we have to celebrate is the journey, not the destination. So what I try to do now, which, again, 20, 30 years later, what I've learned is it's about creating an environment where when someone does fail, it's not you failed. It's, what did you try? What did we learn, right? I like to take the approach of a creative scientist, of an inventor, right? Which is, okay, we tried this. It didn't work. Why didn't it work? What's the data that we have? What happened? But what did we learn? Oh, well, we learned that we shouldn't combine those things, or we shouldn't do this thing. Okay, great. So then I think what you have to do is you have to create a space for failure to happen, because at the end of the day, failure for many people is unacceptable. Large failure, right? So what you have to do is you have to let small failures thrive and hold space for that. So for me now, there are times when you know what's tried and true. So my sort of mental model for that is what I call 70-20-10. It's a very popular thing. I didn't come up with it, which is 70% of the time, put your energy towards things that you know are going to work, that are tried and true, right? You know it's going to work if you do this. 20% of the time, experiment with something new that, there might be some evidence that it'll work, but you're new at it, you're experimenting. And then 10% of the time, do that thing that is completely a moonshot, big picture, like completely crazy, just to see what happens. And what I found is when I've given myself that structure, back to constraints, which we talked about earlier, I've given myself that structure, I give my teams that structure, a lot more magic happens. And what I will tell you is it's the stuff that happens in the 20% and the 10% is where the real magic happens, where the real growth happens. But growing up, in my experience, I had some really bad bosses that were really assholes to me, that did not inspire me to want to do more, that did not care about my ideas. All they cared about is the end goal. And I love being outcome obsessed, but I also think that it's really important to understand how people think and their approach to things, because I think that far too many people focus on the task. Far few people, in my opinion, focus on the outcome. And I think that the more you understand that input drives the output drives the outcome, if the outcome is not what you want, let's go backwards to what we did or didn't do, right? If the outcome is what we want, but we want more of it, let's go back to what was working and double down on that. A lot of times people just will run away from what's working because instead of making it incrementally better, they want to just do something different. And that's where I've learned over time to be more patient. Because at the end of the day, one of the things my president says all the time at my company is, he says, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Nice. And I love that phrase because I think that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And it's more about the velocity and the delta than it is about the speed, right? How quickly can you go from this to that? It's not the grand thing that you're focused on, right? Because small bits of, it's marathon sprints is what I like to say, right? Lots of little sprints in the course of a marathon, but you can't run the entire thing at full speed or it's going to result in bad things. So I hope that's exactly what you're looking for there.
For sure, definitely. And thanks for bringing up the marathon analogy, because more and more often, as you grow up and as you start failing more often, and when you are younger, you might think, okay, now I'll push through this. Now I'll sprint through this specific destination and I'll achieve my goal. I'll be happy at the end. But when you acquire a couple of losses and wins, you eventually realize that you need to focus on the long term. And in order to focus on the long term, you need to pace yourself properly. Yes, sometimes you need to run a sprint, but sometimes you need to walk towards the next milestone.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing to that because I think it's really important. We're using sports metaphors, so I'll go back to that for a second, even though I don't like sports, which is hilarious, but everyone gets a good sports metaphor. I think it's what we do off the field that's more important than what we do on the field. People a lot of times say, Pete, what's your superpower? My superpower is obsession. Absolute obsession. I go deep on the topics that I go deep on. And I move quickly from thing to thing, but before I move on to the next thing, I go really, really deep, right? I ask myself, what is the Pareto principle, right? 80-20, right? What's the 20% of that topic that makes for 80% of the success on it? I dive deep on that. And I can walk through how to do that. But I think what happens a lot of times is people focus on the wrong things. And as a result of that, they think that can all happen in the moment. And that's not the case, right? It's the reason why the best athletes are the best athletes is because of what they do off the game, off the field, right? It's the preparation, mental preparation, physical preparation, experimentation. I think that nowadays, especially in the world that I live in, where I work with designers and coders and brand people and content people all day, right? The ones that are the best at their jobs have one thing in common. They love what they do. And they're constantly getting better at what they do on and off the field, in and outside of work. And let me be clear. I'm not talking about being a workaholic. I'm not talking about working crazy hours. What I'm talking about is taking the passion with them wherever they go, taking inspiration from their kitchen when they're cooking and then bringing that to their design process, taking inspiration from nature and bringing that to their coding practice, taking inspiration from a conversation with good friends over a nice glass of wine, bringing that to their teams. That's what I mean by that. And I think that the difference between the Joes and the pros is that's what it really comes down to, is it's that level of passion and obsession. And I think that right now, like, the world needs more of that, in my opinion. And if you're doing something that you don't love and you can't find the purpose in it, fucking stop doing what you're doing. Do something different. Move the fuck on. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of what I say at the end of the day, is like, move the fuck on. Because if you can't get behind it, if you're not excited about it, if you can't find the why in it, you're in the wrong place. Stop blaming your boss. Stop blaming your job. Stop blaming your customers. Blame yourself, hold up the mirror, and move the fuck on.
Great. This is a topic that definitely we can record a whole separate episode on why we need to, first of all, discover what are our strengths, then what are our passions, see a way to match all of those stuff to be at the same time valuable not only for ourselves but for those around us. And down the road, if you can turn this into some profitable activity, if you find somebody to pay you for doing it, this is the idea of living the good kind of life. But because the time is limited, I want to move on to something else, and I assume that it will be very important, and there will be a lot of insight from you on this, because of your field of experience, because of what you provide through your expertise and through your agency. But the bottom line is storytelling. Like, I understood that not only B2C brands can have a story behind it, some hype story that you can sell for to advertisers. Every company, every brand, every professional can take a look and see what their story is. And this is something I mentioned in the beginning. Your portfolio of companies is diverse, and how exactly do you find common threads among those different kind of companies? And is it storytelling involved? How is storytelling involved in your activities?
Look, it's really simple. My job and my team's jobs is we are overpaid matchmakers.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is our job is to understand the customer, who's buying the product or service. Our job is to understand our customer, who's paying us, the brand, etc. And our job is to find the commonalities where both these people can win and to make that matchmaking happen. I think that mediocre marketers think that B2B and B2C is different. Expert marketers understand that humans are humans, and that what motivates humans, fear, greed, love, understanding the basic core understanding tenets of, we know that only emotion endures. We know that stories are the vehicle for how information travels, not statistics, not mathematical computations, but emotion-led stories. So it doesn't matter if I'm working with Google or Lego or a brand you've never even heard of. And I've worked with all three of those, right? What matters is ultimately, what is that exchange, that commonality, that intersection in the Venn diagram, right? Every strategist loves a good Venn diagram. I do too. But it's about, where's the intersection? And when we find that intersect, that emotional intersect, that creative intersect, then we can use code and technology and design and interfaces and marketing and all the other stuff that you and I both love. Then we can layer and stack those things on to ultimately unlock success. So that's the same thing we do with every single customer we have. It doesn't matter what they sell. It really doesn't. What matters is, show me the value you create. Show me the transformation you create in somebody's life. And I'm going to find a way to tell that story that's going to stick with them, that's going to resonate with them, that's going to move them. And then I'm going to figure out where they are, right? The message is the medium, and the medium is the message. If I'm finding them on TikTok, very different than if I'm finding them, buried down the rabbit hole on a subway train, right? I have to find people on both those places. But first, you got to know your who, then you got to know your why, then you got to know your how. Too many marketers focus on the how and the where first before they've actually gotten to the who and the why. I see it all the time. Like, seasoned, experienced, 20, 30-year veteran marketers, and they somehow get too high in the ivory tower, and they forget that at the end of the day, your only job is to be a successful matchmaker. And when you do that well, marketing transforms your company. When you do that poorly, marketing puts your company out of business.
Great way to sum it up. I just want to confirm, like, at the end of the day, no matter if it's the B2C cap or the B2B cap, we are speaking to people. Those people have some certain emotions, and in order to turn those people into your own customers, you need to find what are the emotions that drive them and what are the solutions that that will help them get to the end point that they're after. But again, not what they say they need, but actually observing more on what they actually do and what activities will trigger them and push them toward this specific end goal.
Yeah. Here's the bottom line. People don't want to buy your shit. They want to buy better versions of themselves. So when we sell people better versions of themselves, when we take people on that journey and we do that through stories, people buy in at a much deeper frequency, at a much deeper level. And that's why everyone continues to chase the Apples, the Nikes, the Airbnbs of the world, is because those companies understand that stories and experiences are the things that move brands, and that brands aren't logos and fonts and colors. Brand is the connection and the space that you occupy in the hearts, minds, and wallets of your customers. And when you plug into that, everything else gets a whole lot easier. When you don't plug into that, everything else is a way harder, and it feels like a hamster wheel of just chasing and chasing and chasing and chasing without any payoff at the end.
Great, Pete. Thanks for summing it up in a such precise way. Now, one by one, I can continue coming up with questions and just go on down the rabbit hole. But I appreciate your time, so I want to close this conversation off with a specific question that I ask all of the guests, and this is the question is there a specific fictional or non-fictional story that you, when you need some kind of inspiration, you always go back to, and you always try to remember the specific story?
Yeah. I'm going to date myself a bit on this one, and I'm probably going to offend some people on this one, but I don't care because this is my story. You can have whatever story you want. My story is Rocky.
Okay.
And the reason my story is Rocky is because, for one of the fondest things that I have, one of my fondest memories of growing up with my dad is on the weekends when it was rainy outside or whatever, we would watch 80s action movies together. And what I love about the Rocky story, you talk about the hero's journey. The Rocky story is a beautiful story, not just on the screen, but also off the screen, right? You had a failing actor who grew up in a terrible home relationship. This was Sylvester Stallone, the writer of Rocky, right? And because he was born with, when he was born, when they were pulling him out of his mother when he was being delivered, it damaged nerves in his mouth. So he kind of sounded like he had like a little bit of a slur or whatever. So this guy had a lot of things against him, right? Family upbringing, broken home, the whole thing. He wrote the movie. No one wanted to do it. He was trying to be an actor. No one wanted to cast him in the kind of things that would give him a thing. So he wrote it, he directed it, and he starred in it, right? So off the screen was just as powerful as on the screen. But as a kid, what I loved about Rocky is he was the underdog. And it was that underdog spirit that could rally community, that could inspire community, that could rise above the rich guy, right? That he ended up beating and defeating, that became his friend in the end, right? So for me, it's a fictional story, but one that's near and dear to me because it resonates on a number of frequencies. It makes me remember when I was a kid. It makes me remember spending time with my dad. It makes me remember that even as an underdog, which I have always been the underdog can win and can come out on top. And I believe that the future of companies is small teams doing big things. And the Rocky story, the narrative, the maxims, the things that are in that, you can unpack and it can make for a winning team. Now, some people might want to cast a different cast, might want to take a different story, but the narrative, the hero's journey of Rocky can be applied to today's modern world in a way that I don't think people realize enough because they're stuck on the execution. They're not stuck on the concept. If you go back to the concept of that fiction movie, there's a lot of beauty in it. And that's why, to answer your question, whenever I'm having a tough day, whenever we lose a big thing or a tough things happen, I realize it's about getting back up, Life's going to knock
Yep.
you down. You got to get back up and you got to keep going forward. And it might sound cheesy, but you know what? I've overcome some of the hardest obstacles in my life with health and finances and relationships and business, all because I can tap back into how that story made me feel. So back to the hero's journey, it's the stories we tap into that give us hope. It's the stories that we tap into that can give us the will to win over time if we keep going forward.
Great. And I love that you mentioned, the fact that you need to keep pushing forward no matter how often life hits you down. It just, when you started explaining why Rocky is your favorite story, favorite thing to relate to, it also resonated to the fact that the way you approach those failures, small failures might be often, but this is the way to improve yourself, to see which ones are your weaknesses, which ones are your strengths, and double down on what is important.
Absolutely.
Great, Pete. Thanks for sharing this story. Thanks for giving us a behind the scenes of the way you think, the way you approach your business and life. But before I let you go, is there something else you want to talk to our audience about? Something that I forgot to mention or to ask?
No, I mean, I just want to say thanks to you and thanks to the audience for tuning in. I hope this was valuable. The reason I'm here is that I believe that creativity and curiosity is broken, and I'm here to try to inject creativity in people's lives and help people realize that the same level of creativity and curiosity that they had when they were children, they can have as adults. And when they tap into that creativity and curiosity, they're going to be more happy, they're going to be more fulfilled.
And this is one of the reasons I'm having these conversations and these interviews, these new connections. When we get familiar and when you tell me your story, I kind of feel like a kid back in the days when you meet another kid in front of your building on the playground, and you start talking about all of those common stories that you all love. So once again, thanks for the time, thanks for sharing your story with us, and yeah, talk. I hope to talk to you soon enough.
Likewise, thank you.
See ya.